No lawyers in my family. I would have been fifth generation engineer, come from a long line of engineers. My grandfather did not speak to me for a year when I decided to go to law school because he very much wanted me to be an engineer. Moving here in the early 80s, particularly to the South, should be a shock to anyone that there were, as today, there were still a lot of racial issues, particularly back then. 1981 is only 15, 16 years removed from the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, so it's not a long time. Some towns still weren't acting right in the early 80s, as you might imagine. And so I just kind of had this interesting perspective coming here, being a U.S. citizen, but being very much treated as an immigrant, as a foreigner, as an other, and just kind of realizing the power of the law and the existence of the law early on in my childhood. I just, for some reason, I was just very interested in equal rights and civil rights, the civil rights movement, the historical aspects, even at a very young age.
Welcome to the Founding Partner Podcast. Join your host, Jonathan Hawkins, as we explore the fascinating stories of successful law firm founders. We'll uncover their beginnings, triumph over challenges, and practice growth. Whether you aspire to launch your own firm, have an entrepreneurial spirit, or are just curious about the legal business, you're in the right place. Let's dive in.
Welcome to Founding Partner Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Hawkins. Really excited about today's guest, a longtime friend of mine. We used to practice together way back in the day. And I was talking to somebody earlier. That was probably one of the funnest firms I ever worked at. Yeah. But yeah, maybe we'll tell some stories about that. But
a little too fun. It's no longer around.
Exactly. But yeah, so welcome, Dax Lopez. He is a former judge here in the Atlanta metro area, and he's retired from the bench, and now he is a plaintiff's trial lawyer. So Dax, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us what you're up to nowadays, and we're going to dig into some of your past exploits here.
Great. So my name is Dax Lopez. I'm a partner at Campo, Grayson, Lopez. We have a small office in Dunwoody, Georgia, where we practice basically wrongful death and catastrophic injury type cases. We don't do a volume practice. So, we have a very small number of cases, but a lot of our cases do involve either really catastrophic, horrible injuries, lifelong permanent injuries, or someone unfortunately has died because of the negligence of someone else. These are very complex cases. We do product liability cases. We do premises liability cases. We do medical malpractice. So usually and trucking cases as well, but usually the more complex cases tend to end up on my file system, and we end up working on these cases. And hopefully, if we get a chance, we'll try them. We are trial lawyers, and we try cases.
So it's the three named partners. Do you have any other attorneys? What kind of staffing do you have?
No, it's just the three named partners. So Tony Del Campo founded the firm originally with his now partner, Randy Grayson. They were college roommates back in the day at Emory, and then they each went their separate way after law school. Tony started out in South Carolina, worked his way back to Georgia, and became a fairly prominent plaintiff's attorney before he became a state court judge. So Tony was the first Hispanic state court judge in the history of Georgia. I was the second. And then Randy did a spell at a big firm in Texas and then made his way back to Georgia as well, and ended up working at Alston Bird for a few years before he went out on his own. And those guys teamed up about 10 years ago and started a firm with one other guy who's no longer here. And then I was on the bench at the time and before they pulled me on. Right now, though, we only have 3 lawyers and three staff. So we have 2 paralegals and 1 case manager / receptionist. So we're very lean and very mean.
Yeah, and you're hitting some big verdicts. We'll get to that later. So that's good. So let's go way back, man. Let's go way back. So even before law school. So you did not grow up here, right? In the U.S.
Well, born in Puerto Rico. Grew up in Puerto Rico until I was 6. Yep. So I lived in Puerto Rico until I was 6 years old. Moved to Augusta, Georgia, in 1981. Not a mecca of diversity in 1981. It was very much black and white. Very few Hispanics. People did not know what Brown could do for them in 1981. And so we moved to a really kind of a outskirt of Augusta, a place called Martinez. Well, I thought it was Martinez because it is Martinez. And so I remember I show up to school my first day. I don't speak English. Very nervous going to my elementary school, and I see the name Martinez Elementary. And I got real excited because I thought someone there might speak my language. and they quickly corrected my pronunciation. It's Martinez, Georgia.
They
Which,
probably
incidentally, I've come to learn is named after Jose Martinez, a Cuban who used to own all that land, but of course, no one called it Martinez. So it's still to this day Martinez.
they probably said it more like Martinez, right?
That's right. I still can't say it right.
Yeah. So what was that like, man? You come in here, culture shock. It's not a completely small town, Georgia, but it's a smaller town. I mean, what was that like?
Well, in 1981, I mean, it was fairly small. It was difficult. I'll say that. It was not an easy transition. I did not speak English. My brother didn't speak English. My parents spoke English, but we didn't speak Southern. So we didn't understand, the accent and the twang, and everyone's talking about the dogs, and they're like, the what? The Bulldogs had just won a national championship a year earlier, so it was but everyone had UGA flags, and my parents didn't understand this whole obsession with dogs, and they still didn't know what it was. And I remember going to the Waffle House and didn't understand why there's a whole house for waffles. I mean, it was just it was a different time and a huge culture shock for us, but we quickly acclimated. The other thing that was interesting is that no one really talked to us, like our white neighbors, our black neighbors. No one knew what to do with us. No one knew anything about Puerto Rico. They didn't realize we were part of the United States. They just thought we were some foreigners. We would always get asked questions like, how'd you get here? And we're like, on a plane. And they're like, really? You have planes? I'm like, yes. And what's the currency like? And we're like, what's the exchange rate? And we're like, 1 to 1. It's the same currency. Things like that. Growing up, my whole childhood was pretty much like that. But we were only there for about a year, and then we started moving. I lived in about 6 or 7 different states growing up, mostly in the South. Although we moved in Pennsylvania and Illinois, lived in Chicago for a year. But I lived in Kentucky and Alabama and Tennessee, and also lived out in Kansas. So it's kind of all over, but we kept coming back to Georgia. Georgia was kind of a stopping point that we kept moving back to. And I ended up going to high school here in Georgia, actually, in Cobb County, McEachern High School, class of 1994. Go Indians. And so Georgia just kind of felt like home because it's the first place we ever lived. Slowly, my family from Puerto Rico started moving to Georgia, which was interesting. I had several family members that moved here and still live here to this day. So Georgia kind of slowly became a place where I called home, even before moving off to law school and all that good stuff.
So let's talk about that. So law school, I don't know if I've ever asked you this, but why law school? Was that something you always wanted to do, or was it like a lot of people, you just didn't know what else to do?
No lawyers in my family. I would have been 5th generation engineer. Come from a long line of engineers. My grandfather did not speak to me for a year when I decided to go to law school because he very much wanted me to be an engineer. Moving here in the early 80s, particularly to the South, should be a shock to anyone that there were, as today, there were still a lot of racial issues, particularly back then. I mean, 1981 is only 15, 16 years removed from the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, so it's not a long time. Some towns still weren't acting right in the early 80s, as you might imagine. And so I just kind of had this interesting perspective coming here, being a U.S. citizen, but being very much treated as an immigrant, as a foreigner, as an other, and just kind of realizing the power of the law and the existence of the law early on in my childhood. I just, for some reason, I was just very interested in equal rights and civil rights, the civil rights movement, the historical aspects. Even at a very young age, I just was completely fascinated by this idea that the law could somehow grant equality where it didn't exist before, and that you might have a venue, a forum to go and fight for your rights under the law in a courtroom was incredibly fascinating to me. And so as far as I can remember, 6, 7, 8 years old, I wanted to be a lawyer. I mean, and it never wavered. And it still hasn't to this day. I'm still very happy with my choice.
Wow. That's pretty cool. I've never heard that. So that's cool. So you ended up going to law school. I know you went to Vandy, I think undergrad and law school.
That's right.
And then after that, what'd you do after that? First job out?
First job out, clerkship. So I clerked for a federal judge in Puerto Rico, actually. So I had an opportunity to go back to Puerto Rico after, living in the U.S. since age of 6. I hadn't really spent any significant time back in Puerto Rico. So it was a nice way to reconnect with my family that was down there, with my culture. I was very lucky that my parents forced me to speak Spanish in the home. So I was able to maintain my Spanish here in the U.S., even though it was very difficult to do so, to be honest. And so I got an opportunity to go clerk for a federal district court judge for a year and a half in Puerto Rico, which was fantastic. I mean, if you ever get a chance to, for young listeners who are in law school, if you get a chance to go clerk in the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, or Hawaii, I highly recommend a tropical location for a federal district court clerkship. It does not suck. It is a lot of fun.
So what is that? I mean, the litigants that come in there, are they speaking English or Spanish or both? Or how does that go down?
No, it's a federal district court. It is by law and by local rule required to be in English. So the lawyers must speak English. The jurors must be bilingual, which is interesting because then you get a more educated juror in federal court. And Puerto Rico is sort of a very interesting jurisdiction. In the local Commonwealth courts, there are no jury trials in civil cases. So they're all bench trials. So all the big plaintiffs' attorneys like me wanted to be in federal court, which is backwards from here, right? In Georgia, all the plaintiffs' attorneys want to be in state court, particularly, a state court, not federal court. But in Puerto Rico, you only got a jury trial in federal court. So everyone's trying to find a way to get diversity jurisdiction. A couple lawyers got in some trouble because they bought my apartments in Miami. And then every one of their clients had the same address in Miami because diversity jurisdiction is as of the day of the filing of the complaint. So they only had to live there at the beginning and the commencement of the action. And so someone finally realized, and those folks were actually prosecuted for fraud and spent a little time in federal prison. But that is sort of a quirk of Puerto Rico that everyone wanted to be in federal court. So we got to see some phenomenally good trials, personal injury trials, every kind of trial you could imagine, because everyone wanted to be in federal court.
That's cool. So you're there for, did you say 18 months, 2 years?
Yeah, about 18 months. That's right. Yeah.
And so after that, did you come back to the States? What did you do next?
I did. So I had a couple of options. Like I said, my family moved around a good bit. When I was in college and law school, my parents lived in Alabama. Then they subsequently moved to Washington, D.C. when I was in my second year in law school. And so I was kind of trying to figure out, do I want to be in D.C. where my family is? But, there's always that chance they'll move again. I had opportunities in Alabama where we had lived for several years, and I had opportunities in Atlanta. So I had clerked in all three cities and had some offers in all three. So it kind of was interesting. I just sort of decided Atlanta was a great sort of just a midpoint between small southern town and big DC type, urban area, because in DC, everyone's an attorney. So it's really hard to stick out, right? Just thousands and thousands of attorneys. Birmingham was a little too small probably for what I was looking for. So Atlanta just kind of had that mix of just great southern town, big enough. You had sports teams and a lot of nightlife and culture. And I had family here in Georgia. And so I figured this would be a good place to come. And I had an offer at Holland & Knight, a big international firm. And that's where I got started after my clerkship.
And what kind of stuff were you doing there?
So I was placed on the product liability team. So it was early 2000s. If you'll recall, there were two really big recalls nationwide at the time. It was the Ford Explorer and then the Firestone tires that were on those Ford Explorers both got recalled. And so I was on the Firestone team for most of my early career. And so there are hundreds of lawsuits, if you might imagine, recall suits. So I learned, sort of the product liability tire litigation work is what I spent a lot of my time doing. I did employment work. We represented the city of Atlanta. I did a lot of condemnation work. I did just business relations work. So it was great because I got to do a little bit of everything. Tried some cases, business litigation cases, condemnation cases, and got to work on all these product cases, learned about personal injury and ins and outs of these tire cases. And so it was a good starting point for my career for sure. And I was there for 3 years and ultimately decided I wanted to try more cases. And so sometimes at big firms, as you well know, you just don't get to try as many cases as you'd want to, especially if you're not doing insurance defense type work, which we did not really do at Holland & Knight. So I went to a small boutique firm called Ash, Rafuse and Hill, and particularly because I wanted to go work with William Hill, who I still maintain is probably the best trial lawyer I've ever encountered, seen, or been around. And he was just an incredible mentor. And so I met Hill and he recruited me and I decided to go work with him. And I got a chance to try some cases with him and really sort of learned how to try cases being around him and trying them with him. So that was a great experience for me.
I forgot you did that tire litigation. My first law firm job was defending Michelin tire. So I did a lot of those tire cases too. Yep. And it was around the same time. Now, they weren't subject to a recall, but, the cool thing or the interesting thing I found that ultimately sort of got me a little bored with it was, it was the same case every time, basically. It was, they sued the car company, whichever one rolled, and they sued the tire company. And there was only like 3 experts in the country on each side. So
That's right.
It was the same 3 every time. And then you could trace, the funny thing is you could trace the evolution of their theory of the defect, and it would change, over time. It was this for a while, and then they figured out that doesn't work anymore, and they switched to something else. And it was like, it's the same thing every time. So anyway,
still, that hasn't changed. That's still the same.
yeah. Well, now you're on the other side. So,
and one of my biggest cases since I joined the firm was a tire litigation case.
I got to ask you about this story because I probably have misremembered it in my mind, but it's one that I occasionally tell without naming names. But you're also, so you're one of the few Hispanic Jews around, right? So, and that's a key to this story because at one of your firms, we're not naming names here, but you were given an assignment on Christmas or something, right? Tell me about that story so I can remember.
Yeah, it was, you're right. Without naming names, we had a big fee arbitration that was coming up in January of the following year. It's like late November, and we get on a call with the arbitrator, and we're trying to figure out deadlines for briefing and all that good stuff. And so the arbitrator's like, look, talking to me and my partner, hey, why don't you guys turn over your, just turn in your brief, first week in January, after the holidays. Partner's like, no, we can do it. We can do it late. You can do it, December 26th. And the arbitrator is like, well, that's the day after Christmas. Like, I'm not even gonna be in my office. Like, take the holidays. Don't worry about it. And the partner was insistent that would be our deadline. Our self-imposed deadline would be December 26th. And I'm looking at him, I was like, look, I know I'm Jewish, but I don't want to work Christmas either. And sure enough, man, I worked Christmas Eve, Christmas Day. I was taking edits because he did not let me email it to him. He made me physically bring him the brief on Christmas Day in the afternoon. And he made me sit out in my driveway, in his driveway, while he read it and did edits. And then he didn't even let me sit in his house, walked it out to me at my car, handed me his edits, and asked me to go input them that day. And so I went to the office Christmas Day and was inputting his edits on Christmas Day so we could turn in this brief on December 26th, which to this day, I remember when we got to the hearing, the arbitrator's like, y'all really could have turned that brief in like first week in January. I didn't even read it until like a week ago,
Yeah. I hear these stories. And this is a true story. I've got some others that are true stories. I can't imagine, and maybe it still happens today, but I can't imagine any associate today doing that stuff, man. Yeah. It's hard enough to get them to come into the office. Yeah.
They'll quit before they do that. Absolutely. Yeah. Back then we didn't know any better, right? That's kind of, you did what you were told. And, I remember being called out of a vacation. I only got like a 4-day vacation, but I remember like day 3, you got to get back to the office to work on this issue. So get back, and you just got to cut your vacation short and come back to the office. Can't imagine doing that today either.
Yeah. It's funny, the folks I know that have sort of been through it, I think you go one of 2 ways. One is they feel like they got to haze someone else just to get them back. But I think most people say, I'm never going to do that to some younger attorney.
Right. It's just not fair.
Yeah.
It's not. It wasn't right then. It's not right now.
Yeah. So moving on. So you left, at some point you left Hill and his boutique, and that's where we ended up meeting because we ended up working at the same firm.
That's right.
And I'll call it a business boutique. And so, and we did, I guess, a wider array of litigation there. And I do remember another story that happened there. Well, we got lots of them, lots of good ones, but half of them we can't tell.
That's right. The non-disclosure agreements prevent us from
but there was another story I remember was, I don't know if you remember this, but somehow you got a default judgment because the other attorney just, I don't know what happened. And it was a pretty big one. I can't remember how big, but it was significant. And then, of course, and it had been in default, long in default. It wasn't like it was just a missed by a day or something. And of course, I think your client was like, yeah, we're taking it. And then opposing counsel, I think, started freaking out and started sending you, hey, let's do these stipulations. I can't remember exactly what it was. And
Oh,
then, and finally, he's trying to insert, that we agree to open default and all this stuff. And you're like, no, I'm not agreeing to that. And then finally he sent you a draft that you said, yeah, you can sign my name. And that's not what got filed. Do you remember
that's
this?
not what I want. Yeah. That man, I think we had to go in front of the judge and like, those are the kinds of stories where then the judge is like, well, we'll just, edit the agreement or whatever and not like throw the dude under the bus, right? I mean, that is one of the craziest, sneakiest, most horrible things you can possibly do to someone, and then just to have a judge be like, we can just change it. I mean,
Yeah, we'll just open default. Well, I
just open,
remember, I
like,
think like another partner at his firm got involved, and there was like some 80-page affidavit where he just fell on the sword big
right,
time. I mean,
yeah.
hey,
I mean, and that's what you need to do to begin with. Like, not
yeah.
when you're facing sanctions. I thought you were going to start talking about the story when you and I both had children that were about to be born.
No, that's a
Um,
good story too. That's a good one. I love that one.
you know, Jonathan and I have kids that are very, very close in age, like weeks, I believe, or weeks or at least a month close in age. And so this happened to be the summer where the judgeship became available, became open, and I was going through the application process for the judgeship. And we were in the middle of a very contentious, it was a lender liability case against one of the big banks in town. And we had this lawyer on the other side who just, I mean, talk about unreasonable. That's probably one of the most unreasonable lawyers we've probably ever dealt with. And so I kind of sent out this email to everybody saying, hey, my wife's due date is the week of June 8th, June 9th. And I'm just not scheduling depots or hearings or trials that week. And, I'm happy to work with y'all on scheduling on any issues, and, we'll get everything done. But just that week, I'm going to be in the hospital and going to be enjoying the birth of my daughter. And pretty much everyone responded as you would expect. It was like, congratulations, absolutely, we'll work with you. But there's always that one lawyer who just can't do that. And so I got this very nasty email about how I was trying to delay the litigation, and they wanted to take depositions all that particular week. We want to set all these depots that week. And I can't, I called that lawyer and said, hey, we can extend discovery. There hasn't been a single discovery extension in this case. I'll work weekends, whatever we need to do to get it done, but just not that week. And this lawyer was very insistent that that was not going to be the case. And so ended up noticing a bunch of depots for that week. And so I go to my good friend, Jonathan Hawkins, whose wife was also pregnant at the time with twins. But I think you guys were a few weeks or like a month behind us. And I asked Jonathan to cover those depots. And I tell the story all the time at CLEs. And I said, look, I could have taken it to the judge, but, I just don't like taking piddly things to judges. I want to go fight about substance, not about things that we should be granting professional courtesies to our brothers and sisters across the aisle. So I asked Jonathan to cover the depots for me, and he very graciously agreed to do so. But I remember my daughter was born June 9th, and I remember later that day or the next day, Jonathan's wife had a medical emergency. I remember you guys went to the hospital as well. So the depots got canceled. And I remember getting the nastiest email. I mean, picture this. I'm standing there with my newborn daughter in one hand and the old school BlackBerry on the other, right? I mean, this is 2010. We still had BlackBerries. And I'm reading this email from this attorney about how Jonathan and I conspired together to cancel these depositions. And, when I tell the story at CLEs, I said, yes, Jonathan and I conspired to knock up our wives at the exact same time, so they would be born 9 months later in this exact same time frame, so we could cancel depositions that hadn't been even noticed. But yes, that was the theory of the conspiracy. So I called that lawyer up from the hospital and I said, look, my colleague is having a medical emergency with his wife, and this is a real emergency. This is not fabricated in any way. And most lawyers would be showing some concern for him and his family. And instead of writing this incredibly ridiculous email, and I told this lawyer straight up, I said, look, the way I was taught how to practice law by older, wiser attorneys is, you always have to give those professional courtesies for life's milestones, right? Births, deaths, weddings. These are the things that, are important to us as humans. And we need to, be watching out for one another. And If our colleague across the aisle has a birth or a death in the family, you give them those extensions. Obviously, you shouldn't abuse that privilege, but we certainly weren't. And I was like, look, and you just never know where I might end up. Just our professional relationship. You don't know. One day I might end up at a firm that you might apply to. And, I'm certainly going to think about this. Or I might become general counsel at a company that you one day may want to represent. You just never know where we're going to end up in our professional careers and how our paths will cross in the future. At that point, I wasn't even thinking judge. Like that wasn't even on my radar. And lo and behold, 2 months later, I got appointed to the state court of DeKalb County, and I saw that lawyer the very next day in a deposition on that case. And the lawyer congratulated me on my new appointment and said to me, and I'll never forget, I hope you remember how easy it was to work with me. And I was like, oh, don't you worry. I will never forget you. So I tell folks in CLEs all the time, the lawyer you abuse today might be your judge tomorrow. So just be careful how you treat others in this profession, because you just never know how that might come back and hurt you.
So true, man. So true. I'd forgotten that story. That's such a good one. That was a scary time. That was a really scary time.
No, your kids were in the NICU for a while, weren't they?
Well, my daughter stayed there for like 4.5 months after she was born.
I remember. Yeah,
that was scary. She's fine now. Everybody, she's fine.
That's great.
14, about to start high school. So
so is mine. Yeah, born in the same time. Yep.
Yeah, they grow up fast, man. It's crazy.
Yeah, they do.
So that's a good segue. Real quick, thanks for listening. If you're getting any value out of this podcast, please take 2 seconds to hit the subscribe button and leave a 5-star review. It would really mean a lot to me. Now back to the show. So you ended up on the bench from that firm, only the second Hispanic state court or court of record, you will say it here in Georgia, judge in the history of Georgia. How was that, man? How was that transition? I mean, you're going from working a lot, working cases, having opposing counsel, all of a sudden, as I've heard you say, your jokes just got really funny at that point, right?
Yeah, you get better looking and a lot funnier when you take the bench. All of a sudden, everyone's your best friends. That's for sure. I want to just quick back up and just kind of tell you how that kind of just quick story how I became a judge is just because it ties into my law partner. So as I mentioned, my law partner was the first Hispanic judge in the history of Georgia. He was appointed in 2002 by then Governor Roy Barnes. Tony had been a plaintiff's attorney. He was a young guy. I think he was 32 when he took the bench. And so that just happened to be the year that I moved back to Georgia to start my job at Holland and Knight. And so it was really exciting in the Hispanic community, never having had a judge. And also happens that same year was the first year we had the first state rep and the first state senator, first Hispanic state rep and state senators who were elected to the General Assembly. So it's kind of an exciting time in the Hispanic community. We're kind of getting a lot of firsts that year. And that's kind of when I came on the scene here and as a young attorney and started, kind of working my way through the organizations in the Hispanic community. And so Tony and I became friends pretty early and became a mentor pretty quickly. And so he and I were in touch and we were on the same boards together and we kind of worked together in the Hispanic community. And so a few years later, fast forward to like 2009, Obama's president, Tony was on a short list for potential elevation to the federal bench. And that's when he called me. And I was the president of the Georgia Hispanic Bar. And that's kind of around the same time I was joining our former firm. And he kind of said to me, look, if I do become the first federal judge, Hispanic federal judge in the history of Georgia, I kind of want to make sure that another Hispanic takes my spot on the state court because, I'm the first and only. And I was like, yeah, that's great. Who do you want me to call? I'll start recruiting whoever you need me to recruit. And he, that's kind of when he planted the seed. And he said, I think you'd be a great judge. And I think you should consider it. And up to that point, I had never, ever thought about it, never considered it. I clerked for a federal judge. Several of my colleagues at Holland and Knight went on to become judges. They're still on the bench. The Honorable Susan Edline, State Court of Fulton County, and the Honorable Sarah Doyle on the Court of Appeals were partners that I worked for at Holland and Knight. So several of my good friends had gone onto the bench, and I still had never considered that as a potential career path for myself until Tony sort of planted that seed. Unfortunately for him, when he was younger, when he first came to this country from Peru, there was a period of time where he was undocumented. And because of that, some of the senators here in Georgia would not blue slip him. So because of that, the Obama administration would not consider him as a potential viable federal judge nominee because they just would never get blue slipped. So that's just kind of interesting because that's, Tony's really the person who sort of put that bug in my ear. And then he sort of helped me, when there was an opening on the court, he called me up and said, hey, openings coming available. No one knows yet. Go ahead and start putting yourself in a position to go through the process. And so, I got a little bit of a head start on some other folks, and luckily it worked out and was able to get appointed, even though the same organization that Tony and I served on the board, the Georgia Association of Latino Elected Officials, GALEO, had just sued Governor Perdue at the time on some voting rights issues. And so when I was going through the process of the Judicial Nominating Commission and then the short list, and then you go to interview with the governor, we had just sued him. And that was his first and only question. It was, hey, man, I see you're on the board of Galeo. You guys just sued me. And I was like, yes, sir. He's like, were you in the room when they made that decision? I was like, yep. And did you vote for it? Like, sure did. And, I just told the governor, I just, as a lawyer, I just don't believe anyone's above the law. State of Georgia, governors included. If we feel that you're violating the law in some way, you have to be held to be accountable for that. And we were successful in that lawsuit ultimately. But I'll give Governor Perdue a lot of credit. He ended up still appointing me despite that. I think if you remember, Jonathan, I kept coming into your office the day after the interview, like every 30 seconds, like, man, I wish I hadn't said that, or I wish I'd said this, or like second guessing everything I said. And I think I was in your office when the governor's office called. As I recall, they came to get me in your office, and I went back to my office, talked to the governor for all of 40 seconds, and came back to your office and said, I think I've just been appointed.
Nice. Yeah.
I wasn't 100% sure because it was a very short conversation.
That was awesome. Did he ask you to dismiss the lawsuit?
Federal court, man. I was a lowly state court judge. But to answer your question, yeah, when you make that transition from being a practicing lawyer to a judge, particularly I was very young. I think I was 34 at the time. One, like you said, everyone all of a sudden is your best friend. They want to know you. They want to take you to lunch and take you to get beers or whatever, because everyone wants to know the new judge. And I, like I said, I was very young, and a lot of people in DeKalb didn't know who I was because I was working in Fulton. I worked primarily in Fulton, and my practice for a very long time was more national, not very Georgia centric, but very national. Cases all over the country. So a lot of people were like, "Who the hell is this guy?" And so I get on the bench. And I immediately start thinking about all the things that ticked me off as a lawyer, right? Like sitting in a depo and having opposing counsel who is obstructing the deposition, right? Or, being involved in litigation when the other side's not turning over all the documents or not responding to your discovery request. And I started thinking, I want to make sure that my courtroom is efficient, and I want cases to move. And those are the kinds of things that slow cases down, right? When you've got people who are playing, discovery games and having all these shenanigans. So I created pretty early on a pretty comprehensive standing order that I put in place, and still a lot of judges have adopted since then. So that's
to cut you off real quick. I remember that you were one of the first, maybe the first, to do that, and that was pretty groundbreaking at the time.
Yeah, on the state court for sure. I was the first one on my bench, and my bench had seven judges, and none of the other judges had it. It was pretty common among the federal judges. Judge Batten had a really good one, and I sort of plagiarized a lot of his and just sort of adopted it and edited it for the state court, put the state court rules and all that good stuff. But it really was very much here's how I view discovery, right? You're not going to go in a deposition and instruct your witness not to answer unless you have a really good faith basis. You're not going to do all those rote objections that everyone does in every single discovery request and then not turn anything over. You need to tell them what you're withholding based on the objections. And it was very much do not file a motion to compel. You will call my chambers every time there is a discovery dispute, and we're going to get to the bottom of it on the phone, and we're going to keep cases moving. And I got to tell you, in 11 years on the bench, I probably had 2 motions to compel the whole time that were actually formally filed because I instructed the parties to do so. But every other dispute was resolved on the phone. And guess what? Cases did not linger or die on my docket. They moved quickly, and pretty quickly, by my third year on the bench, I had the smallest civil case count, and it remained the smallest civil case count for the remaining 8 years I was on the bench. And the day I left the bench, my case count was half as much as some of the senior judges. So I had 790 civil cases on my docket, where some of the more senior, older judges had 1,700 cases still on their dockets, because we just kept cases moving all the way to resolution, baby. I mean, you just keep them moving, because how the cases resolve. Mm-hmm. Trial dates, is the number one, motion or trial date. That's how cases get resolved. And so we ruled quickly on motions, and we put things on trial calendars, and we kept you on those trial. And I specially set everything, which few judges would do that. Especially set every single civil trial was specially set.
That is, there's a few things I really liked about when you're on the bench. I don't think I ever actually came before you.
Some of our former partners did.
Yeah, sure. But I do remember, especially set. That's one thing. I mean, especially when you have witnesses from out of town and they say you're on a 3-week trial calendar, and it's just not fair. It's not fair to your experts, to your witnesses, all this stuff. So that's really a good thing. The other thing that you did, and I remember reading about it from time to time in the legal newspaper, is you weren't scared to sanction lawyers, where, a lot of the state court judges, because they're elected, they want everybody to just work it out, and they don't want to come down hard on anybody. And you weren't afraid. You weren't afraid.
You don't know how true what you just said is. The first time I was going to sanction a lawyer, I go to one of the most senior judges on my bench. I've been there decades. And I said, look, this lawyer has done something that I find to be fairly egregious, deceptive, lied to the court, deceived the other side, withheld documents, all the things you can possibly imagine. And I was like, and I think, it's incumbent upon us judges to, really stand up and sanction that kind of behavior. You got to curb it. So I'm considering this fairly significant sanction. And that older judge looked at me and said, well, when's your election? And I said, what does that have to do with it? And I didn't see that in the factors. I looked at the factors on the legal factors, and I didn't see that one. He's like, well, the only people who can run against judges are lawyers. And are you sure that you want to rock the boat where you get that reputation where you're the guy who sanctions lawyers? Because, it's just better not to do that. Just deny their motion or whatever. And I was like, no, because again, I remembered what it was like to practice law. I'd only been on the bench a couple of years. I still had very vivid memories of all the shenanigans that happened in litigation. And I was like, no, I'm good. If this is going to cost me my judgeship, that's fine. I'm going to do what I think is right. And I ended up sanctioning a very prominent lawyer at a very major firm for a very significant sum of money. When I say significant, I mean 6-figure type money. And that, I'm sure that's probably one of the stories you read in the Fulton Daily, because it certainly made news. But I just felt, this is just necessary. And I got to tell you that the firm apologized to me in the court on behalf of that partner, apologized, because they didn't realize what was going on. And guess what? You sanction one or two folks, and I think I sanctioned 2 lawyers pretty significantly. You do it twice, no one tries it again. And I sanctioned 2 lawyers in 11 years, and that's it. Everyone else is on their best behavior. At least in my courtropom, they're on their best behavior. That's right. I would hear all the other judges talk about these same lawyers and complain and bitch about all the things that they were doing. I'm like, you got to put the hammer down once or twice, and they won't do it again. I'll tell you that right now.
It's like children. You got to do it once or twice, and then they straighten up, right?
That's it. They straighten up. Yeah. No one tries it. Yeah. And, I was contested twice. I had 2 contested elections in the time I was on the bench. Most judges don't have one. And so I was just of the opinion, I was like, look, come and get me. I will continue to do what I'm doing, because I feel like, I run a good courtroom, and I think the good lawyers know that this is how courts ought to run. And it's always funny, people who came up to me, the lawyers who come up to me every once in a while, I'd be like, man, I love your standing order. It's great. That is exactly right. And then I'd have other lawyers like, man, I really hate your standing order. And I'd look at them and say, well, I wrote it for you. Because clearly you're the lawyer who wants to, hide the ball or not turn over documents or make up, objections that are obstructive in deposition. So I was thinking about you when I wrote it.
Nice. So another thing I wanted to touch on that I've heard you talk about, sort of you got to see a lot of trials. And on the state court, just for people out here who are not familiar with Georgia, state court, which you were a judge in, you don't do felonies, you don't do divorces, but you do a lot of PI trials and business trials and stuff like that. So you got to see a lot of stuff, a lot of juries, all that kind of thing. And you got pretty good at sort of predicting, calling what the verdict was going to be, not only who won, but even within, a standard deviation of what the amount was going to be, right?
Yeah. So my staff and I, we were a very heavy volume court. So DeKalb County is part of the Metro Atlanta area. So lots of cases, lots of big cases, and a lot of small cases too. I mean, the bread and butter of every state court is the, soft tissue injury car wreck case, the less than $50,000 in damages. And a lot of those cases get tried. I'm talking like lots. And we were trying 4 a week. I can knock them out 1 a day. And so my staff and I would always play this game where we would let's guess what we think at the end of the evidence, just like everybody else. Like if we were the jurors, who wins and how much? And we would write it down, we'd put it in an envelope, and we'd open it after the verdict and see who got the closest. And I got to tell you, man, we got really good at this. And we tried so many cases that my bailiff and I and my court reporter were getting within $5,000 of every verdict. We're pretty dead on in most cases. And that's just, the DeKalb County juries are very consistent. There are only probably 2 cases in 11 years where we were just dead wrong, just missed it completely. But for the most part, yeah, we knew who was going to win. I remember my wife came to watch my last trial. Was a big medical malpractice case as a judge, and she had never seen me on the bench in 11 years. So she's like, this is your last one. I'm going to come watch. And after the openings, I looked at her and I said, defense verdict. And she's like, but you haven't seen any evidence yet. I was like, I've seen enough of these, and I looked at the jurors, and this is going to be a defense verdict. And sure enough, man, they were out for 20 minutes. And after a week-long trial, it ended up being a defense verdict. A couple of our friends, I won't name any names. I'll tell you at the end of the show when we close out. A couple of good friends, mutual friends of ours, tried their very first case as plaintiffs' lawyers in DeKalb County. And I always tell the story, and we always reminisce with them because they're extremely successful plaintiffs' lawyers now. I mean, they get massive verdicts now. They are doing extremely well. But their very first trial back in 2012, when they just started their firm, they texted me and they said, hey, we're trying the case downstairs in one of my colleagues' courtrooms. Come down and watch. And so I go downstairs and I sit in the gallery and I watch their opening, just the plaintiff's opening. One of our buddies did the opening, car wreck case. And I went back to my office. I didn't even see the defense opening. And I texted our mutual friend and I said, hey, defense verdict all day. And he, same thing, wrote back. He's like, how do you know? You didn't even see their opening. You haven't seen any evidence. You don't know what the case is about. I was like, look, man, I've seen enough of these juries. I can tell you it's a defense verdict. Sorry to say, it's a defense verdict. And so he's like, we'll see. So a day and a half later, get a text from him. He's like, plaintiff's verdict, booyah. And I was like, all right, how much? Question mark. And he's like, 200. They're like, 200,000? And he's like, no, $200. The verdict was 40% of 200 is $80. So he's like, we're over at the brick store, drinking our sorrows, drinking our profits away.
Oh, man. Yeah.
They have since done very, very well. And they're an incredibly good firm, great lawyers, great trial lawyers. But we always talk about that as being their first big trial. And they're like, how did you know? And I was like, again, you sit here and watch these jurors day in and day out, you get a feeling about how things are going to go.
Yeah. So I want to touch on it. We don't have to dwell here, but you did actually get nominated to be a federal district judge. You got your turn, like your mentor. I remember that. I remember talking to the FBI. I remember they came by and it was really sort of weird. I felt like I did something wrong. They're asking me.
You're the reason I didn't get it.
Yeah, they're like, has he ever done anything wrong? I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. But anyway, so, I mean, you got fairly far along in that process, and you were about to get nominated, or you did get nominated, but you got held up. You never got a hearing. And I know that was, at the time, not fun. And so, I don't want you to dwell on it, but
yeah.
There's silver linings and different doors have opened. I think you're doing way better, but we'll get to that.
Of course. Yeah, that was an interesting process. My name had sort of been floating around for potential federal judgeship since like 2012. And, there was an opening in 2012, and Georgia has had two Republican senators at a time. The White House was Democratic with Obama in the White House, and they just couldn't get on the same page as to who they wanted on the bench. The White House and the senators couldn't get on the same page, and they were having a hard time. And so my name starts getting floated as a potential consensus. I was a Republican at the time. I am no longer a Republican. I can say I'm a proud Democrat. Go Harris. But at the time I was a Republican, and that helped me get my judgeship in 2010 for sure. But my name starts floating around, and ultimately they went with now Chief Justice Mike Boggs. And that's who they nominated in the 2012-2013 timeframe for that spot. And then I watched my good friend Mike Boggs go through that process that was not kind to him. They said a whole lot of horrible things about him. He had a really contentious Senate confirmation hearing, which was brutal. That maligned his character, and he's a good man, he's a good person, and he's a great judge. He sort of didn't deserve what happened to him, and so when his nomination was clear that it wasn't going to go through, he wasn't going to get a vote, and it was withdrawn by the White House ultimately after hearing. They were sort of back to step one, like what do we do with the spot? And, about early 2015, maybe late 2014, my name starts popping up again. And I get a call. Now we have a different senator. We have David Perdue, Sonny's cousin. So then Governor Perdue's cousin is now the U.S. senator. He's the junior senator. And we had Senator Isaacson, who was an elder statesman, wonderful man. And so they start, kind of the process anew. And I get a call. A lot of the Senator Perdue people had worked for Governor Perdue. And so they all knew me because I went through the process with them. And so I kind of got that call from his office, from some, a mutual friend of ours, you and I both know very well, called me and said, hey, man, would you be interested in sort of re-putting in for this? I know you've been considered in the past. And I was like, no, I'm good. I saw what they did to my friend Mike Boggs, and I'm not interested in putting my family through that. And I'm having a good time on state court. And while it's very humbling to be considered for that kind of position, I just don't think the politics of it all, and just didn't want to go through it. And, I had a long history of advocacy for the immigrant community. Sort of what got me, we ended up suing Governor Perdue about was voting rights. And then we got some immigration reform issues that we were working on. That's how I got to know Senator Isaacson, quite frankly, as I lobbied his office for immigration reform. And so I was like, I just don't feel like I'm the right candidate. I'm going to get, the way the Republican Party is right now, they're very sort of anti-immigrant. And I'm not interested in kind of putting my family through that. And they're like, no, it's, it's a done deal. It's going to be you and two other names, two other judges, whoever the White House picks. That's it. It's a done deal. Everyone will be in agreement. Like both senators have pre-cleared these three names from these three judges that we're going to submit. And we're good with all three of y'all. And we're going to let the White House pick one of these three names. And so I was like, okay, so I talked to my wife, and she sort of said, look, you'd be the first ever federal judge, Hispanic federal judge. And if it's not you, who's it going to be? You're the only state court judge. Like there's not a whole lot. We didn't have a lot of bench strength back then. And so I was like, all right, so I'll put my name in. And if the White House picks it, all right, we'll go through the process. But I really didn't expect the White House. I know who the other two people were, and they were excellent jurists. They still are to this day. And I really firmly believe that one of them was going to get chosen. And somehow, some way, the White House decided to go with my nomination. The other two judges were appellate judges. One was on the Court of Appeals. One was on the Georgia Supreme Court. And I was this lowly state court judge in the mix. And so it's funny. I'll tell the story every once in a while. I was at Disney World with my family. And I get a call from the Department of Justice. And I thought they were calling because I was working on some access to justice issues regarding interpreters, the need for interpreters in courtrooms to help people understand court proceedings and all that good stuff. So I was working with the Department of Justice on those issues. So I thought that's what they were calling about. And this young lawyer from the Department of Justice gets on the phone and starts talking to me about questionnaires and background checks and the FBI and how they got to move this process quickly. And I'm like, hold on, what are you talking about? I'm literally standing outside of Space Mountain with my boys, and they're like, yeah, no, for the federal nomination. I was like, oh, okay, so you guys are doing background checks on the three of us. Great. And he's like, what are you talking about? I was like, well, I know there were three names, and do y'all do checks on all three? He's like, no, we typically only do the check on the nominee. And I was like, hold on, say that again. And he's like, look, he finally, he realized, and he's like, has no one talked to you? I was like, no one has called me. He's like, well, let me start over. Congratulations. You're the presumptive nominee for the federal district court bench in the Northern District. And we got to get your process going pretty quickly because we want to get you nominated quickly. And I was like, holy cow. So the next few months were a whirlwind. You did the FBI. The FBI did a whole background check. You got to do these questionnaires. You got to open up your entire life. There's like no guidance from the White House or from the senators. You're kind of just on your own. You get no information from anybody. You're just sort of left to your own devices. And you get called to the White House. You go meet with some staffers, and they talked about the background check and what the FBI found, and ABA does its thing, and they rate you, and luckily I got rated qualified for the bench, but ultimately I got nominated by Obama in July of 2015, which coincidentally happened to be 3 weeks after Donald Trump announced his run for the presidency. And if y'all recall that far back, because I know a lot has happened in the last 9 years, his number one issue was immigration and how Mexicans were rapists and murderers. And, they're not sending us their best. They're sending their murderers and their rapists across the border. And that really, sort of set immigration as the forefront issue for that presidential election. And all of a sudden, my background became real relevant to a lot of these Republican senators who are jumping on the Trump train, including Senator Perdue, who very quickly jumped on Donald Trump's bandwagon. And all of a sudden, immigrants were the worst thing ever. They're all murderers. They're all killers. They're just not good people. And I just kept thinking, it's like, man, the entire backbone of the Georgia economy is built on the backs of these immigrants. Agriculture is the number one industry in the state of Georgia by far. 60 billion plus industry. And guess what? It's not you and me who are out there picking the onions or the peaches or any of the other crops. It's these immigrants from South America and Central America. And we would not function as a state without these folks. And I just really, really hurt to hear them being demonized. And I had to be quiet and I couldn't say anything because I was a nominee and you're not permitted to speak. And, all of a sudden I become the most activist nominee in the history of Georgia. There were websites dedicated to my destruction. National anti-immigrant groups and white supremacy groups were targeting me, and it was nuts. It got ugly real fast, for sure.
Well, I know that was not fun, and that would have been quite an honor. But as I said, some doors close and others open. So that brings us to sort of where you are now. So now you got to reunite with your long-term mentor, Tony Del Campo, and you guys are, like you said earlier, doing high-end plaintiff's contingency work. And, you pretty quickly, I think, after you joined the firm, you went and tried a case and popped a big one. It was like a $77.5 million med mal verdict, right?
That's right. So, yeah, potentially, I think she's a friend of yours. Natalie Woodward went to Georgia. Natalie and I went to high school together, and we've been friends for a long time, and we have kids the same age, and we belong to the same community pool. And we were sitting at the pool one day right before I left the bench, and I sort of mentioned to her I was thinking about stepping down, and she's like, if you do, I'm going to call you because I've got this case I want to talk to you about. And sure enough, within a week or two from me stepping down, she called me up and said, hey, I've got this case that no one likes. I've been working on it for 5 years. COVID delayed it, for those couple of years. It's pending in DeKalb, and I believe in it, but none of my partners do, and no one else that I know. Everyone thinks I'm going to lose, because it involves a drug-addicted bipolar young man who died in what appeared to be a suicide, and just a lot of people don't like that. She said the mediator told me I was going to lose. She's like, take whatever you can get because you're not going to win. She's like, but I just feel like there's a case here. So she told me about the case, sent me some of the materials and asked me to look at it. And so I did. And I called her back and I said, hey, Nat, I think you have a $50 million case. And like silence on the other end of that line. And she's like, can you repeat that, please? And I was like, yeah, I think you've got a $50 million case all day, every day. If you can prove half of the things that are in these pleadings, you're going to be just fine. And go try your case and it's going to be great. And she's like, no one has ever said that to me. And I explained to her why. So the case involved a 29-year-old guy who had developed bipolar disorder pretty early, 19 years old, which is pretty common is when you develop this kind of mental illnesses. And as a result of his mental illness, he also developed a drug addiction, which is also not uncommon. If you develop schizophrenia or bipolar, it's not uncommon that you find out that marijuana and cocaine tend to level you out. And so he developed a pretty significant drug addiction. And he was in and out of treatment for 10 years voluntarily. He was trying to get better. He was a gifted kicker. He had a scholarship to the University of Georgia, Alabama, Auburn, all wanted him. He was a long distance kicker, football kicker, but he wasn't able to go to college because his mental illness issues were pretty strong. And so he's trying to get better, trying to get his life back on track. And sort of long story short, he finds his way here to Georgia. He was in North Carolina. Mom and dad bring him here to a facility. And the first facility finds the right combination of drugs to stabilize him. It's the first time in 10 years he's stable. And then he gets moved to a drug addiction facility. And there's a psychiatrist there who's supposed to treat both the drug addiction and the mental illness. And that guy completely just does not believe that my decedent was actually bipolar. He just says, you're a drug addict. You're not really bipolar. Disregarding 10 years of diagnoses from other psychiatrists and other mental health professionals, which all found this guy to be bipolar. And he's like, you don't need these mental health drugs. And he discontinues them. And so my guy starts to decompensate very quickly, as you might imagine. The psychiatrist does not tell any of the treatment counselors what's going on. And so the treatment counselors start seeing this guy acting out, and they think he's just got a bad attitude. They don't realize that he is mentally decompensating. And next thing you know, they kick him out of the facility. They're like, you're violating our rules and you're being unruly, which is what you would expect someone who's decompensating to do. And they literally kick him out of the facility. And 3 days later, he is naked on I-85 in the middle of a psychotic delusional break, probably didn't know where he was, walks out in the middle of I-85 at 4 o'clock in the morning naked, lays down in a lane facing traffic, and is run over by 3 vehicles, almost decapitating him, severing an arm and legs. It's horrible, horrible, horrible way to die. And I just fully believed, having run a DUI court in DeKalb County, I ran an accountability court for 11 years. I was familiar with substance abuse issues. I was familiar with our populace because everyone in that court was a DUI as a DeKalb County resident. I knew that everyone on my jury, my potential jury, has dealt with drug addiction and mental illness. Just knew that mom, mother, brother, sister, cousin, uncle, somebody in my family or a friend has had drug addiction or mental illness or both. And it's not, these concepts are not going to be foreign to them. And this is a guy who's trying to get help voluntarily. And the people who are supposed to help him were the people who failed him the most and led to his death. So I told Natalie, it's a $50 million case every way you slice it. And sure enough, we tried it. 14-day trial. It was a grueling, very tough trial. 14 trial days. We got to the end of the trial, $77 million. We asked for the $50 million, which I was true to my word. We asked for $50 million. The jury gave us $65 million in compensatory damages. So they gave us $15 million more than we asked for, plus $11 million in attorney's fees and $1 million in punitive damages. So it was a good verdict.
That's
a good verdict.
That's a good one. You've had another big one too, right? You have like a 30 million something.
Yeah, last year my partners and I tried a case together. Very tough case. Probably the largest verdict involving an undocumented immigrant in the history of Georgia. So our guy was, older, middle-aged guy, 47, had 3 teenage kids. He had 10 brothers and sisters, was in the country illegally, but was working hard, was a construction foreman. He was supporting like 6 or 7 of his siblings. He was supporting his mom in Mexico. He was, supporting his kids here in the U.S. Just a hard worker, good guy, just a really hardworking guy. So he and his wife separate, and he moves in with his brother in this horrible mobile home trailer park in Clayton County. And he and his siblings all lived there. He had like 4 or 5 siblings that lived in the same trailer park because it's super cheap. It's like $300 a month. It's very cheap. But as you might imagine, that kind of place probably doesn't have nice gates and security and a swimming pool. No, it was just a terrible place to live, but it was cheap. And these folks really spent a lot of their money on their kids. All of their kids went to Emory, Georgia Tech, Kennesaw. Like they were all succeeding and thriving because mom and dad were investing in their educations, but they weren't investing in where they lived. And so this mobile home park had a long history of crime, lots of shootings, lots of armed robberies, lots of car thefts. Actually, there had been a previous lawsuit where a resident was shot by an intruder who was trying to steal something. And so we went ahead and we filed suit. And it was a tough case because of this. Our guy was staying with his brother off lease. So he's not on the lease, so potential trespassing issues. He's there for 2 years. Then the day of the robbery, there's someone stealing his car in the middle of the day. His sister-in-law knocks on the door of the bathroom. He's taking a shower. She's like, hey, someone's stealing your car. He runs out and literally shorts, nothing else. But he does grab a gun. And the gun is inoperable. It's an antique gun, but we think he was trying to scare the guy off. We don't think he was actually intending to have any sort of gun battle. No one knew that the intruder had a gun. The kid was a 20-year-old kid who's stealing the car. It was a stick shift. So he's stalling out, literally trying to get out of this, this trailer park. He doesn't know how to drive the stick shift, and he's stalling out of this trailer park. And our guy runs out and catches him before the thief is able to leave the facility. And no one is a witness to what happened there, but there's a gun battle, and our guy is shot and killed right there. And the kid gets away with the car. He's later captured and it was convicted for the death and murder of our decedent. So, it's a tough case. That is not a straightforward case any which way. A lot of people are going to be like, well, if he'd stayed in the trailer, he wouldn't have been shot. He kind of put himself in that position. He assumed the risk. He was a combatant, everything the defense. We knew the defense was going to say all those things. And so not an easy case, but we felt strongly enough that people in Georgia believe in the Second Amendment. People in Georgia believe that you get to protect your property. And we really framed it as this guy was a hard worker who was supporting a lot of people. And this was his only mode of transportation to get to work. If he didn't have that car, he can't provide for his family. And he didn't have the money to buy another car. So we really framed it as he saw his mode of making money being stolen, and he was going to try to get it back. So we tried to settle the case within policy limits. I mean, we were willing to take very little money. I mean, the family was ready to take just a few $100,000. There was only $1 million policy. It wasn't a lot of money. We were willing to take less than the $1 million. We gave them multiple opportunities to do so. They offered us $25,000 is the only offer we ever got. And it was a week before trial. And I was like, all right, let's rock and roll, man. And so we tried this case in Clayton County over 5 days. And the jury just was a great jury. And I think, did a great job framing the issues and got a $31 million verdict, which they did apportion 20% to our guys. So ultimate verdict was about $25 million. But that's still pretty good on a $25,000 offer.
Yeah, it's real good. The other thing in your PI firm, so you're having great success. The other thing that I really like that I think is unique, and I'm not sure anybody else can do it here in Georgia at least, is, you've got 2 former Spanish-speaking Latino judges that do PI work, right? That is, you got no competition there, right?
Yeah, we kind of have a niche for sure.
I mean, there's probably not even a one former, Latino judge.
And the great thing is my partner, Tony, was also just the state bar president like a year. I mean, he just finished his state bar year as president of the state bar of Georgia. So we're very small, but we're, luckily have a lot of high profile members of our firm who, we're doing things in the community. I'm on the board of governors. So all the judges know us, most lawyers know who we are. I'm also on the JQC, the Judicial Qualifications Commission. So, I work to regulate judges who are not acting ethically. So it kind of keeps us involved in the community. And so I think people know us and respect us, and they know we're not going to, if I walk into a judge's courtroom, they know I'm not going to ever say anything that's going to impact my reputation. I'm not going to lead you astray. I know how hard it is to be a judge and make decisions. And so I'm going to try to make it as easy on the judge to make those decisions. I think that adds value to our cases and to our ability to represent our clients zealously. So yeah, it is a nice niche to have 2 former judges who understand, how would we have ruled on these issues as we're evaluating cases, that we have those conversations all the time.
So you've been very gracious with your time. I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I do want to ask, so for anybody out there who's thinking about starting a firm, maybe they have started a firm, and you can keep it to trial firms if you want. Do you have any advice to any folks out there on,
Sure. Absolutely.
how to succeed, whatever that means?
Yeah. So luckily, I walked into an already established firm. So I kind of had a slightly different situation, but it was a firm that was unfinished in the sense that since I've joined, we've done a lot to make it better. And I've also had the experience of my wife is a solo practitioner, and I've watched her build her firm over the years. And so I've kind of learned from her and watching her struggles in building up her firm. And, the couple takeaways, and these are things that we have implemented is, your job is to sell your knowledge, right? If you're a contingency lawyer, you're not making money unless you're trying cases or settling cases. And that's and part of your job too is to bring in cases. That's a lot. Practicing law, trying to get cases resolved and bringing in new cases. That is a full-time gig right there. So what I would say is don't be afraid to, get as many vendors as you need to work on that administrative stuff. I know a lot of lawyers who try to do all the administrative work, and I saw my wife do it for years. And it would just drive her insane because when she's doing administrative work, she's not making money. She's not working on things that are going to result in money. And so don't be afraid to get good software systems. We have great, when I joined my current firm, they did not have a good file management system. And it was kind of a free for all on the computer. And I was like, we got to get organized as a firm so we can work more efficiently on these cases. So don't be afraid to get good management systems, outsource your HR, your payroll. If you have any staff members, you should not be spending too much time on that kind of stuff. Your job is to bring in cases, settle cases, work on cases. And anything that takes away from that is really robbing you of time that is really more essentially and more elsewhere. So I saw my wife sort of do that in her own office. She finally got to the point where she's like, she got software system after software system to make her life easier. She got a virtual assistant, which was amazing. She got intake people in Colombia. So she's got people in Colombia who she can train to fill out forms. She's an immigration lawyer, so they can fill out forms. They can do the intake in Spanish and English. And that took that away from her, which was a game changer for her because it opened up so much time. So I wouldn't be afraid to do those kinds of things. If you're gonna hire folks, you can't do this alone. Make sure you have a good paralegal or good case manager, someone who you can trust and is a sort of jack of all trades. Sometimes we don't look for folks who have specific skills. What I'm looking for is that person who's going to take ownership of whatever they're doing and who is going to try to figure stuff out on their own, who, they're not going to be the kind of person who ever says, well, that's not my job. When you're in a small firm, everything is your job. Everything is, I do everything. I'll do my own copying, my own filing. We got to do what you got to do to be successful. So you want to try to find those kinds of people. And then we train them. We can teach everything else. I can't teach you to have a good attitude. I can't teach you to be a person who takes ownership and who takes initiative. But once I find that person, I can train them on everything else. And that's been critical for us. And, there are so many, and I know that I'm sure y'all talk about it with other folks. There's so many resources out there for solos and for small firms. I mean, there just are. There's software for almost anything. And with AI now, learning how to use AI more effectively to do document reviews or medical reviews or even draft initial demands. I mean, there are just so many good things to help you manage your time better and where you're just editing drafts instead of drafting everything yourself, right? So I think just those kinds of things, you got to spend money to make money. I think a lot of solo practitioners and a lot of small firms sometimes are just afraid to spend the money on those systems just because, I know it's an anxiety, it creates anxiety, but when you're able to focus on the things that make you money, you'll be more successful than if you're spending 50% of your time on administrative tasks that take you away from the practice of law. So those would be sort of my big takeaways. And since I joined the firm, we've revamped the website, we've done the marketing differently, just because I think we were doing things were a little too loosey-goosey, I think. It worked for a long time, but with 3 partners, you kind of had to structure a little bit. We hired more people. I think they were a little afraid to hire more paralegals to work on our cases. And I was like, if you build it, they will come. We hired paralegals and more cases came in, and it was great. And it's great for workflow and keeping everyone happy. And you're not overloading one person with every one of your cases. So just don't be afraid to do those things and then spend your time wisely in going out and getting more cases. And you got to network in this business. And if you don't have time to do the networking and the building of the relationships because you're too busy in the office working on all those administrative tasks, you're going to be losing money ultimately.
Well, it's working. You guys are popping some big ones. So for anybody out there that may have a case in Georgia they want some trial counsel on, what's the best way to find you, get in touch with you?
Yeah, so our website is DGL, Del Campo Grayson Lopez, so dglattorneys.com. You can just Google me, Dax Lopez. There's not that many Dax Lopez's in this world, so if you Google me, I'm pretty sure my profile will show up. And that's a lot of what I do is I get called, sort of as parachute counsel. Since I left the bench, I'll tell you, this has been the first 3-month period that I haven't been getting ready for a trial. I've tried 2 big cases, but I've gotten ready for 4 pretty big, sizable cases since I left the bench because I was being brought on to cases late in the game, and I was getting ready for these trials these big trials where cases the discovery was already done, so I was kind of playing catch up. But that's kind of what I do is I get called by a lot of lawyers, particularly lawyers who have cases in DeKalb. I know a lot of the judges. I know the juries really well. And that's kind of, spending a lot of my time is working on other people's cases, and I love it. I love jumping into new case, giving you new perspectives, things that maybe you hadn't considered because you're so in the weeds. And so I've been pretty fortunate that I keep getting those calls and always happy to help whoever needs help in their trials.
Well, Dax, man, this has been fun going down memory lane. Thanks for coming on.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Founding Partner Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to stay up to date on the latest episodes. You can also connect with Jonathan on LinkedIn and check out the show notes with links to resources mentioned throughout our discussion by visiting www.yourlawfirmgc.com. We'll see you next time for more origin stories and insights from successful law firm founders.